Shelley is tearing up, and she's clutching a book to her chest. And we've just spent the last hour at her kitchen table, research field visit. We've been looking through her pins, all recipe pins, trying to figure out which ones are going to be the best for her family. And she's jumped up to show me this book she's had fully bound of recipes that she's adapted from her pins. But this is not just any family recipe book. She explains to me, well, Kelsey is going to be going to college next year, and I'm going to give this to her, and she might have a moment where she misses home, and she's going to be able to open this book, and she'll be able to make something and get a taste of home. And it doesn't take a researcher to figure out that this book is just as meaningful for Shelley as it might be for her daughter. And that's disregarding the fact that I don't know of any freshman dorm rooms that have stoves, much less kitchens. But when we think about this story, we think about Shelley, it's interesting to look at it from this reader behavior lens. And it's funny, because at Pinterest, we don't really talk about readers. That's not really a phrase we use. And at the panel here, we've got someone from LinkedIn, from Google, from Facebook. And we are more likely to talk about users, talk about people. At Pinterest, we call them pinners. And not readers. We don't think of that as the primary action that they do on any of our sites. We talk about maybe they're browsing, they're engaging with content, maybe they pause to read a specific comment, or maybe they click through to read an article. But at least speaking from Pinterest, it's very rare they're going to find a pinner who's going to describe that they read Pinterest. But if we go back to Shelley, and before I do that, for those of you who might not know Pinterest, Pinterest is a visual bookmarking tool that helps you save and discover creative ideas. And what she's doing is she's been browsing a bunch of different recipe ideas. She's been saving them to boards, curating them, and then deciding which one she wants to adapt, rewrite, and turn it into this book that has now become very precious to her. So if you look at what she's doing, right, there's some reading in there. She's definitely reading through all those recipes, but she's also curating. And in a way, she's writing as she rewrites these recipes. So if we move away from thinking just about the reading piece, is there anything else that we can learn from Pinterest about the way people are engaging with content? And one of the things that's really special about the way people use Pinterest is you have this constant pivoting between different types of content. And that's part of our design, right? Because we have lots of these columns of these visual pins. And it's very common that you're going to hear someone start with, oh, wow, look at this fantastic recipe that my whole family might like. And then pivot to, oh, that watch actually might be the perfect holiday gift for my brother. And then pivot to, look at the cute puppy, right? And those kind of pivots feel really natural on Pinterest. And I think it's unique. We hear so much more about an app-centric world where sites and tools are optimized to help you do one thing really efficiently, which is when sponsored content or business content gets a bad rap because it's interrupting you, it's distracting you from that. And yet on Pinterest, if it's good content, right, it's just another opportunity to pivot in this way. So this idea of being in the sea of content, that happens outside of Pinterest too, right? So how are people navigating that? That's one of the things we're going to discuss here. And to do that, I'll need to introduce my panelists for this panel that we've titled, Why People Read, Stories Told About Stories Read. And as I introduce them, I'm going to bring a Pinterest tradition. When anyone joins our creative team, we ask them a series of questions made famous by James Lipton inside the actor's studio. And I'm not going to go through all the questions with all of them, but I will do a few. So to start, we have Jimena Vengochea, and she's very at home at this conference because she is a writer, illustrator, and researcher. She's been published in Newsweek, Inc., Huffington Post, as well as many others. Right now, she works on the content strategy team at LinkedIn, and she focuses on how people think about news in their professional lives. And prior, she was a UX consultant in many startups in New York City, and also spent many years in the fine arts in Paris. I happen to know that she is fantastic at visualizing complex ideas into very charming drawings, and she has a knack for vintage hunting. Now, Jimena.
Yes.
What is your favorite word?
My favorite word, since you alluded to France, I will pick a French word. I really love the phrase ma bichette, which is French for my dough. It's a term of endearment. Every time I visit a different culture or learn a different language, I try and compare those. So there's like lovely words like mein Schatzi in German, ma bichette in French.
Mon petit chou.
My petit chou.
My little cabbage.
My little cabbage, exactly. So that's a recent one for me.
What is your least favorite word?
Okay, so yesterday my flight was delayed. I came back from New York. I was home for Thanksgiving, so I will say that my least favorite word currently is delays.
Great.
Yeah. Next, we have Bethany Pickard, and she is a design researcher at Google, where we used to work together there. And she works with designers, engineers, and product teams. She's also an instructor for Google's Design Thinking Lab, which is both in the US and Asia. And before that, she led UX research for digital products in startups and is fantastic at evangelizing creative, adaptive research methods. I know from personal experience that she is a star insight synthesizer. We both share a penchant for Post-it notes, and she makes excellent punch. Bethany, what sound or noise do you love?
I would have to say my favorite sound is the sound of my scooter. And frankly, any other scooter I hear going by on the street, it always catches my attention, and I just love that little going down the road.
Right. What sound or noise do you hate?
Well, last night I was driving with a friend, and it was raining, and the windshield wipers on my friend's car were not working properly, and that was just about the worst sound I had heard in a long time.
Next, we have Stephanie Carter, and she's a manager of the Facebook research team. And before that, she was at Bolt Peters, where she consulted to clients like the New York Times and DreamWorks. She's also done research in the health space at a medical device incubator. And before UX, she was an urban planner in the Boston area and spent a lot, in fact, most of her time doing post-Katrina New Orleans community work. We're both Northwestern Wildcats, and I have it on good authority that she once lived deep in the jungles of Peru. What profession, other than your own, would you like to attempt?
Probably ophthalmologist.
Oh. Tell me more.
It's kind of the art and science of the sciences. I love eyeballs.
Who doesn't really? Who doesn't love eyeballs? Yeah. And what profession would you not like to attempt?
Probably a deodorant tester. There's people who actually smell armpits to see if deodorant is successful.
Right. That's my backup plan. I know. So to kick off this panel, we started talking about what it's like being in a sea of content, right? So we know people have access to more information than ever before. And how do you see people using all this information? What shifts have you noticed in users? And Jimena, let's start with you.
Sure. So I focus on professional content with LinkedIn, and one of the things that we've seen is sort of a shift between thinking about professional content in terms of just being industry news, industry insights. So if you are working in finance, there are certain websites or journals that you go to regularly, to really broadening what that definition means. So when we talk to members and find out what they think about professional content, they've expanded that definition. So they include things like if you're thinking about changing jobs, like interview questions, reviews of a company, what kinds of paths people took to get there. So even someone's profile could be leveraged as a type of content that would help impact someone's career. And even going beyond that, just thinking of things that are tangential to your actual job, so side interests, things that you might not think would have a direct impact on your career, are actually totally considered to be professional content. So there's this idea of, I don't at all follow sports. It's not part of my job, but it's something that I should be aware of so that going into a meeting, I have, some moments that I can build rapport around some game that happened recently. So that's certainly one shift that we've seen, is just that definition itself is widening.
Social capital on the sports feed. Any other stories from the field?
So the idea of navigating the sea of content, I have a story that where I observed a woman doing something kind of interesting to get around and sort of create signal amidst the noise. In some recent research I conducted in Morocco a couple months ago, I was sitting in the home of this one woman, and I had a small team, a few other people, an engineer and a designer on our team, and I watched this woman create a Facebook event. Wanted to kind of see the process, and this is something we do at all the companies that we're at. We kind of observe them closely, and we see what kind of successes, failures they have, how they want to use the products. And she was a person who used the classical Arabic script, so a lot of it I did not understand what she was typing. Luckily I had a translator with me, but one thing I noticed is that when she wrote the title of the event, she was using Latin characters, like English characters, with numbers, and I had no idea what was going on. It didn't look like the script anymore, and kind of poked into that further and understood that she was doing this to kind of get more of a reach. So she was creating, the event she was creating was this, this protest of sorts to invite a bunch of people in this sub-community she was in. And this alphabet that she was using is something called Latin Arabic. Does anybody here, raise your hand if you have ever heard of what this is? Okay, me either, so I see one person. It was interesting, so I dug into this further, and one thing we often do as researchers is, I call it a quant sandwich, but after we come back with qualitative research, we do some quantitative to understand, like, how does this play out in numbers, what's going on based on what we saw, and found out that there are a ton of people using this special alphabet that kind of evolved because a lot of phones at the beginning didn't have scripts on them, so people used Latin characters and adapted it with numbers if they didn't have the right sounds. We found out that the number of people using this was as common as the Korean language. So if it was a language, it was that common. And it's not a language that we support, and a lot of other platforms don't support. So it was a really interesting piece. And what I thought was particularly interesting in this context is that she was using this to have that reach, because the most people spoke, that, everybody was speaking the Latin Arabic and using that to communicate via chat or however. And there were certain people, if you were speaking French, may have had a certain educational background. Some people speaking classical Arabic and using that with a different kind of educational background. But this broad way to kind of reach people and create an event where more people are going to see it and not get kind of caught in the clog of everything that's out there. So.
I think one thing that hasn't really changed are some of the reasons why we read, and I think we read to expand our worlds, and that really drives us towards content. And I think with the increase of access to information and tools that make it easier to access that information, we've seen a shift in behaviors where people are adapting to emerging needs around collecting and curating and organizing content. And so at first we really needed tools to manage the influx, to manage the quantity, and now we're increasingly needing tools to help us with things like quality and relevance.
So thinking about quality and relevance, right? We've got all this information in easy reach. How do people decide what to consume, what to read? And how do they decide who the experts are? Do you want to start us off, Stephanie?
Sure. So I'd like everybody in the room to think about, who would you trust for the perfect hamburger? Like if you had to, if you wanted to get the best hamburger out there, think about who that person is or the expert is, okay? And then what about love? Who would you trust on love advice? Everybody have answers? So like for the burger,
You're saying that's not the same person?
could be the same person. It reminds me of some research I did at Facebook for the ratings and reviews team, where I was talking to a guy who was complaining about people who post too many food pictures and too much about food in their feeds. And then he mentioned this one guy, and he said, but this guy, he never posts about food, and he recently posted about the best burger he's ever eaten. And it was that infrequency and how often his friend had ever posted about food that made him trust this guy. Like, this guy must have some sort of discerning palate because he normally doesn't say anything, and now he's talking about this burger. So I thought that was interesting. And then for love, do you trust the person who's been divorced 3 times and had that experience? Do you trust the person who's going through it right now and it's super fresh? Or do you trust a professional matchmaker for love advice? And I have a matchmaker story from some research. And so I was working on the search team a year and a half ago and was looking at some early adopters to graph search, people who were using grammar in the query in the way that it was created, so that they might write something like, my friends from India who like restaurants in the Bay Area, like Indian restaurants in the Bay Area. So they were trying to find specifically, a query that included language, not just like searching one word, keyword style. So anyway, we brought in people, and I called people remotely who were doing this more than others to understand why was this working and what's going on. This is the way we do a lot of research, is look at early adopters or just people who are using, like extreme users, we call it, of whatever product we're studying. And lo and behold, somebody came through my recruiting who was a professional matchmaker, and of course, who wouldn't want to talk to a professional matchmaker? So signed that guy up, talked to him, and he had this amazing personal transformation story that got him into the business. And he talked about how he had gone through the Matchmaking Institute, which of course I had to Google. Really interesting place. And I, kind of coming back to the expert thing, what I think is really interesting on that site is how people define themselves as experts. So there's a whole board of people listed, and some take the kind of respected authority approach, like I was a former professional headhunter, and some take the personal, gentle, like love doctor sort of approach, where they describe themselves as their friend's go-to gal for love. And I think it's interesting because people will define themselves as experts in different ways, and the consumers of those products, whatever they may be, love or burgers, are gonna take and believe what they choose, whichever approach they choose.
And I want to share back to the group of some of the ways you described your own expertise. You may remember you filled out a survey for us ahead of time. Thank you for those that did that. And somewhere around you, there is someone who is an expert in Beyonce Knowles' family history and art history. The same person. Someone is an expert in storytelling, someone who's an expert in hair, purchasing quality value-based Chardonnay. And whoever this is, please come find me afterwards. An expert in gluten-free pie crust. I would like to talk to you. But I bet Jimena, given the LinkedIn and it must have a lot of professional expertise associated with it.
Yeah, so our experts don't tend to be in the pie crust industry at all. But we have a publishing platform that allows people to share their knowledge and build expertise by sharing posts about lessons they've learned. So on LinkedIn, you can kind of get several different tiers of knowledge, and talking to users, to members is what we actually call them. You kind of start to figure out what those tiers are. So there's content that is posted by experts. So someone that you know in your industry is a leading expert. You want to hear their commentary on the latest, like Google updates or something like that. And then there's also people within your network who are sharing or posting this. But of course, not all your connections are made equal. So if you see your manager or your boss has posted something, you're probably going to pay attention to that, or maybe you should. That's a little bit different from reading something that someone has posted, and that person is someone that you met at a conference 5 years ago. So in speaking with people, we've really kind of gotten a whole spectrum of who are the experts, how do people define that, and it's completely relative on as to where they are in their career and what their interests are. There is sort of a separate piece, a separate tier, which is our influencers program. So we have like Richard Branson writing about his lessons that he's learned, and so that sort of the more formal level of experts, but really what it comes down to is relationships and how you relate to people and what content is relevant based on that.
And going back to the idea of a sea of content that we're all navigating, you guys, are we losing anything in this sea of content? Beth, do you want to start us?
Sure. I think there's some obvious things that we're losing. I think we're losing access to quality content sometimes. I think we're losing an ability to sometimes be present in the moment or to be mindful. But I actually think that the biggest risk that we have is a risk of losing a sense of the scope and the scale of what we don't know. So if we think about the information that we are exposed to and the kind of stories that we have access to, there's one category of information that's around facts and updates. And there's another category of information that's around depth and breadth. And so this type of information is about the backstory and the context and how we got to where we are and what might be related to that and where we're going next. And it's very easy to access updates. And Matt spoke about this at the beginning of the day today. News in particular, it's very easy to consume a lot of repetitive information, and there's a fatigue that comes with that. And I think that we sort of move away from this ultimate goal that we have of expanding our world when we lose a sense of that backstory.
I can add to that. I think another potential risk is just, the more content out there, the more time you spend consuming that content, potentially the less time you're actually doing things, right? So part of LinkedIn's mission is to be delivering content that is valuable for you, that will be impactful in your career. But if you're only reading that content, then, you're not spending the time actually developing the skills that you're reading about. So our ultimate goal is to be providing content that is actionable and that will inspire you to go out and kind of take action based on what you're reading.
And that's very aligned with how we talk about it at Pinterest also, that our mission is to give you things to discover, things that you might want to do, but then inspire you to do those things. It's the do half that we also really care about, of the idea of each pin might be beautiful and inspiring, but you should also be able to click through on it to go to the website it came from that might give you more instructions on how to take action on it. So we talked about...
Sure, I was just along the idea of consumption from the native advertising panel earlier, who were talking about how you need to know who you want to reach. I think that resonates a lot with us as researchers who've talked to thousands of people and collect that perspective regularly. We often share methods and talk about how we can better understand that. And we not only are we doing interviews, but we're thinking about how can we process this information. I just wanted to share one technique that we've used for when I was doing research for New York Times before I got to Facebook, when I was consulting at Peters. I had interviewed a bunch of people all about how they consume news. And one way that we decided to synthesize was to use metaphor. And my colleague at the time, Sid Harrell, was a linguist who was really into, would write a poem a day, and she was a big proponent of metaphors. And this was a really interesting technique to think about the motivations of the people that you're targeting, or the people that are using a product that you're researching. And the first metaphor that we used to understand them better was food. So we were thinking about when we're wondering how people want their news delivered to them, if we use food as a metaphor, what way do they want it? Do they want fast food? Do they want kind of easy consumable, or do they want the curated end of the spectrum? The all-you-can-eat kind of restaurant, fully prepared situation? Do they want the farmer's market where the best stuff is there but they can pick? Or do they want the CSA, something that comes to them but they will still prepare it? So that kind of as a metaphor to how people want their news delivered. Also, we used relationship statuses, which was pretty fun. So in their approach to subscription models, is the New York Times arm candy? Are they kind of showing it off, the fact that they're reading? Are they sleeping with many people. So like, do they kind of pull from a bunch of news sources, or are they, fully committed and they kind of resort to this one news source entirely? And then also kind of this metaphor of like an anchor or sail. So we were looking at trying to understand their motivations of how people want to feel when they consume news. Do they want to feel grounded, like they kind of know what they need to know for the day, or do they want to feel like something's been opened up for them and they're exploring? So these are just kind of techniques that we use when we synthesize and try to understand what people are telling us, to say, how can we turn this around and provide somebody a really interesting experience in a new way to kind of fulfill the different motivations that people have to consume?
I can't help but notice from your consulting days using relationship status as a metaphor to then end up at Facebook just seems perfect. Yeah. And last question for you guys before we go to Q&A. What do you guys think, what is the opportunity for design to pull connections between the many sources of content that we encounter? Beth, do you want to start this one?
I think design's already done a really good job of making it easy to access and consume these facts and updates. I think there are a lot of examples of that. And I think there's an opportunity for design right now to help with access to some of those deeper dive consumption experiences. I think that is happening, and I think there's more opportunity there. There was a study sponsored by the Associated Press a number of years ago where they looked at young adult news consumption with a goal of designing a new model for delivering news. And I think the insights and the opportunities that came out of that study are still applicable and broadly applicable to digital media. A couple of those in particular were around delivering depth and the opportunity for design to deliver depth and provide these entry points to deeper content. And what they found was that some of the ways to capture readers' attention were through interactive and multimedia experiences, and also, interestingly, around bringing in satire and humor, that those things really captured attention and provided those access points. And then another opportunity was around relieving fatigue and providing balance. And what they found was that readers who experienced fatigue, who saw a lot of repetition in their consumption experiences, became less motivated to discover and explore. And so I think that's an important role that design can play in simplifying and removing some of that duplication so that readers are not conditioned in that way. And also to provide some access points between maybe some of these shallower consumption experiences into deeper dive experiences. One of the ways that the Associated Press has designed, actually their organization, to deliver this type of content is in making the role of the editor as a sort of curator. So an expert, not in the sense of having all the answers or all the information, but providing the connection points and actually designing those connection points for the reader.
Sure. So I think there are a couple of really great opportunities for design and also content strategy when we think about helping people organize content, right? Because there's so much out there that one of the things we hear a lot is that people are just overwhelmed. And so there's kind of a simple rule of thumb in research, which when you're talking to somebody about your product, you should mimic their language. So if they call it something that's not what you call it internally or even externally, just roll with it. And I think there's something to that, and to learning how people are referring to your products and how people are referring to even different categories of content, news, podcasts, what kind of place relationship do they have to each other, and how are people thinking of those? Like, what are their mental models around that? And then how can you transfer that over from a design perspective, both in terms of copy and how you're actually messaging this to people, and then also visually. So how are you organizing all of these different modules, and is that what makes most sense for people in terms of how they're consuming it?
Thank you guys so much for your responses. We're going to head to Q&A, and I believe there are microphones floating around the audience.
Hi, Josh Constantine from TechCrunch. A lot of surveys say that teens don't like Facebook anymore, but the data hasn't really shown that kind of exodus. When you work with teens, do you guys find peculiar cognitive biases about what they say they do and that differing from what they actually do?
I can't speak to teen research myself, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That sounds like you're looking for is there a way that teen users are better at reflecting their own behavior or worse than adults? Is that the question? Yeah. I haven't.
Do teens differ more in what they say they do and what they actually do than other people?
I think as researchers, we are always looking for areas where people do something different than what they say they do, and there are examples of that everywhere. I haven't done too much work with teens myself, but in the work I have seen, I don't see a significant difference between that age group and other age groups.
One of the frameworks that we use to think about it is that people say things, do things, think things, and feel things. And it's when you can find the inconsistencies that usually you can have the most impact if you were to change something with design to help align it. Yeah, but I agree. I haven't seen huge differences in the level of discrepancies for teens and adults. Yeah.
Hi, I'm kind of interested in exploring more about deep versus shallow content and the endless scroll. So I'm seeing a lot of articles that are very short and pithy that just get you to click and read through. They take about 3 minutes, but there's also long-form journalism, which requires more of an investment of your time, but is usually very rewarding. What are you guys seeing on how these two content types play out, and what do people actually prefer?
So I don't know that I can talk about what people actually prefer yet. This isn't a study that I've ever undertaken in terms of long form versus short form. But what I can say is that, at least for LinkedIn, the way that people think about posting is pretty thoughtful and deliberate. It has to be. So you tend to find less of the clickbait, I guess, than elsewhere, because it's tied back to your professional identity. So if I'm going to spend the time and put a blog post out there, it's going to be tied to my profile, so I better have something worthwhile to say. In terms of much longer form pieces, we haven't really done any research on that.
I think there's a question right behind you. Yeah.
Yes, this is actually a little connected to what she just asked. And what I am very interested in is that I am keep on seeing a lot of content that might be even longer and deeper, but still the theme is pretty, nothing really so important to say. I feel that people, by choosing the kind of content that they want to read, sometimes they just go for something that it's silly, it's not so, newsworthy, let's say. And so my question is, what we are trying to do is really bring journalism to a next level, but on the other hand, you don't see people really sometimes appreciating it. So you feel like you are giving a lot of your time to create something that is unique, and you don't get a revenue, and sometimes you feel like people are just so free to choose what they want that at the end they are gonna skip maybe the important things and just go for the funny and silly thing. So what do you guys think about it?
Well, it sounds like it would be a good question to also ask the following panel, who's going to be speaking about the future of journalism. And I can say, at least from my perspective, working at Pinterest, we see it both being used as a tool and also as something for relaxation. We often will see people who have their Pinterest time, which is special, which they might have with a glass of wine or on their tablet in bed. So in those situations, we do see them looking for content that's going to be lighter and more relaxing. But that's just coming from the research I've done at Pinterest, and I wouldn't be able to expand further than that. Do you guys have any thoughts?
I think it is dependent on context. I wanted to go back to something Stephanie said earlier about trusted sources. And when you start talking to people about their daily reading routines, what you start to hear is that they typically have a short list of trusted sources that they go to repeatedly, and sometimes those are accessed at different moments throughout the day. I'm sure that's not a new insight to many of you. But I think what's started to happen is with these emerging behaviors around collecting and curating content, the role of that person who is a really good curator helps to solve this problem of trying to get to the good stuff and not having enough time. And I think some of those trusted sources can be social media sites, they could be people, they could be blogs, they could be publications. But the value of that source is not only in the content that's there, but that it is a path and an entry point to more quality content. And people start there because they know that as they continue to click or tap through, they will reliably discover additional good content that's relevant to their interests.
Yeah, there's a question for Stephanie. I was just curious, so is there a relationship between the food types that people eat and the content that they consume?
Good question. So really it was a tool that we were using. The food one was a tool we were using to understand the different motivations people had for how they wanted their content delivered. So it wasn't that we had, it's not that there's like a simple way to say like anybody who wants fast food wants their news like fast food. It was a way for us to just kind of understand what people were telling us better and almost think about how can we group them by motivation. Because actually what we were doing as part of that process was creating personas, which a bunch of people may be familiar with, but one of the critical things to do with personas is to not look at them surface level, but to go below and say, what are people's motivation? Like what is driving them? And it's not that a 12-year-old and a 60-year-old couldn't share the same motivation. Maybe they should be grouped together in terms of how we want to customize perhaps an experience for that type of person. So it was a way for us to kind of get below all the noise of thinking about these as people and think about it as this motivation that could kind of transcend from like news to food to relationships to like sailing or anchoring. So more of a tool.
At the end of your discussion, you guys mentioned the use of humor and satire as something that attracts readers. I was wondering if you guys could tell us a little bit more about what you've seen and how effective the use of humor and satire has been. I know Facebook kind of experimented with using a satire tag on some of their stuff in the past. So I'd just be interested in hearing a little bit more about that and what you found.
I can start from the Pinterest perspective of, as much as we're often focusing on trying to get people off the site and doing those things, one of the things I've been having the team grapple with is that sometimes the emotion and the feeling, that is the thing, right? That if I'm looking at a cute puppy or I'm reading a beautiful quote or I'm laughing at something that I think is funny on a pin, that moment of, is important too, and that can be the thing that I'm doing, and that's what people, if some people are coming to that piece of Pinterest for as a part of their session, that should be to us just as valuable as going out and making that recipe, or building that new shelf, whatever it might be.
I think there's more information about that specifically in that AP report. I think the key thing is that is a trigger, or that can be specifically designed to trigger a certain reaction that can be an entry point to a deeper dive content experience.
And I think we have a question in the back there.
Awesome, thanks for taking my question. This is a question maybe more for Stephanie and Jimena. I'm just kind of curious what the attitude you see among users is when they come across a piece of sort of not paid content, but paywalled content that someone has shared on the feed. The context I asked that in is I'm a journalist for the Financial Times, which is a very strict paywall. And whenever I share my own work on my Facebook feed with friends, inevitably someone sort of whines about like, how dare you ask me to pay for your work? And I get into a fight about who gets to pay my rent. And so I'm just kind of curious more broadly, like, do you see a lot of angry emotion around paywalled content? Do you see people sharing it because they maybe see it as more authentic? What research have you done there?
So it's not something that's come up in research for me. I haven't heard about people being angry about that kind of thing. On the contrary, what we do here is, we want to see more of this type of content, or we're interested in more of this kind of publication. I think something like 2 million publishers have share boxes from LinkedIn on their site. So we definitely get the opposite, which is, we want more of that, or can we get this publisher on board?
On the Facebook side, I specifically haven't worked in this area. I wish I could give you some more clarity into that, but there are folks who research it, and I'm sure capture those opinions, but I don't have a strong perspective myself.
Other questions?
Hi, thanks. I'm wondering for folks who might work at organizations or publishers that don't have anybody with the word researcher in their titles, what we should be doing as far as tips, tools that go beyond SurveyMonkey put together by committee, or trying to separate the wheat from the chaff in Google Analytics.
Oh, we got this one. Who wants to start?
There are so many things to do. So you're saying without a research team, how do you collect research? Kind of? Okay. So what are some ways? All right. I feel like you're nudging. Do you want to take it? Okay. Well, I think there are scrappy ways to do research, and you have to be careful if you don't have research expertise, of course. But one interesting method that we've used to capture first experience and first reactions to products or new things that somebody's going to be experiencing is bringing in two partners, so two people, and observing and listening to not only the person you're talking to at the time, but also the person who's exploring for the first time and is kind of on their own, and paying attention to that, because part of the challenge when you do research is that you can't be in all these people's homes and see how they would naturally react to something, and especially when you're not a researcher, it's going to be even harder to do. But if you have access to users, to people, customers, whatever you call them in your organization, and having those conversations and trying to recreate a natural environment so that you can kind of capture real responses, that can be really valuable.
Just to throw out other scrappy techniques, I really recommend talking to your Lyft and Uber drivers, right? If you're just trying to find, if you live in the Bay Area, if those are services that you use, it's really just trying to talk to everyone and anyone about it. And I would recommend when you are bringing your teammates in to observe either users or non-users, you really need them to see more than two, because when you watch one user, you realize, oh, not everyone's like me. And then when you watch the second user, you're like, oh, and not everyone's like the first user, right? So just talking to a lot of people.
I would also add, if you have an afternoon and live by a coffee shop, you can set up camp in a coffee shop. This is really helpful if you're just testing things like designs and just want some feedback. Is this usable? Or even, marketing. Can you show them app copy if that's something you're testing? Does that resonate? Pick a table, set up for the day, make friends with the barista, get, say like the next 10 people, just have the barista offer, like, oh, this person over here, they're doing some research. They've offered to buy you coffee. If you're interested, swing by. And they can decline, and that's totally fine. And then the onus is off of you also. So it's the barista who's already engaging with the customer, and you're just kind of sitting, and whoever comes by, now you have a willing participant. Don't spend an hour talking with them. It's only a coffee, but you can engage that way.
I'm also going to teach you my favorite research moderation trick, where if you want someone to expand on something, you just repeat the last word that they said with a question mark. Jimena, would you just say something to me, anything to me?
Hi, Larkin.
Larkin. It sounds goofy when I do it like that, but if someone is explaining, no, but it really works. Someone's explaining like, oh yeah, I was at this conference. You want to be like, what conference was it? Conference? Oh yeah, well I was at the Bold Italic conference. It's called Shift. It's a way that you can get people to continue talking without having to say the dreaded researcher, tell me more.
To build on the coffee shop, I think one thing that we're all hyper aware of is that we live in a bubble here in the Bay Area, and we have other methods to make sure we are indeed talking to the people that we want to be targeting or that we want to understand better. So you can't always fly to Morocco, but you can get on their time zone and do some remote research. So all of us do remote research as well, where you can talk to people around the globe through the computer and have them hug the laptop so you can see their phone, whatever it may be. Pretty hacky, but really important to get outside this zone to understand how the real people are using our products.
Thank you so much for all of your great questions, folks.